I never expected to hear my own daughter say the words that would change everything. Either you find a job, Mom, or you're out on the street. The sentence landed on the dinner table like a cold piece of metal, heavy and impossible to ignore. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her, that maybe grief had clouded my hearing the same way it had clouded my thoughts since my husband passed away 6 weeks earlier. My husband Thomas and I had been married for 43 years. When someone shares that much of their life with you, the silence they leave behind isn't just quiet. It feels like a whole part of the world has been switched off. Our house in Columbus, Ohio had always been full of small morning sounds. Thomas making coffee before sunrise, the radio humming softly in the kitchen, the newspaper landing on the front porch at exactly 6:15 a.m. Now the mornings arrived empty. The coffee maker stayed silent unless I turned it on myself, and even then the smell felt lonely. I was 72 years old, and I was still learning how to walk through a life that suddenly had only one pair of footsteps. That evening, Emily had invited me to dinner at her home, the same brick house 15 minutes away where she had lived with her husband Mark for the past decade. She said she thought it would be good for me to get out of the house, to be around family, to start moving forward. I remember feeling grateful when I drove over. The October air was crisp, about 58 degrees, and the maple trees along her street were just beginning to turn orange. I carried a small apple pie I had baked that afternoon, the same recipe Emily loved when she was a little girl. Back then, she used to sit on the kitchen counter swinging her legs while I rolled the dough, asking if she could sprinkle the cinnamon herself. That memory was still so clear in my mind that when I knocked on her door, part of me expected to see that little girl again, instead of the serious woman who opened it.
Dinner was quiet at first. Mark talked about work and Emily nodded along while serving roasted chicken and green beans. I mostly listened, grateful just to hear voices filling a room again. But as the plate started to empty and the conversation faded, Emily leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together. The look on her face wasn't cruel exactly. It was something colder than that, practical, almost businesslike. She said she had been thinking about my situation. I remember the word because it sounded strange to hear my life described like a problem that needed solving. She said that since Dad was gone, things were different now. Costs were higher, responsibilities had shifted. I nodded slowly, assuming she meant emotional things, the kind of adjustments families make when someone dies. Instead, she looked straight at me and said the sentence again, slower this time, as if repeating instructions to someone who hadn't understood the first time. You either find a job, Mom, or you're out on the street. Mark didn't say anything. He stared down at his plate as though the pattern in the china had suddenly become fascinating. I felt the room grow very still. Outside, a car drove past and its headlights moved briefly across the window behind Emily's head. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a poor attempt at humor, anything that resembled the girl I had raised. But her expression didn't change. In that moment, something inside me shifted quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep in the house of my life. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply realized that the hardest part of losing my husband might not be the loneliness after all. It might be discovering that the family I thought would stand beside me had already started calculating how much space I was taking up.
I drove home that night with both hands tight on the steering wheel, the apple pie still sitting untouched on the passenger seat beside me. The streetlights along Maple Avenue flickered past the windshield one by one, each pool of yellow light appearing and disappearing like slow breaths. I had driven that road thousands of times over the years, usually after family dinners or holiday gatherings, but it had never felt this long before. My house waited at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac where Thomas and I had lived since the early 1980s. The place looked exactly the same when I pulled into the driveway. The white porch railing, the small oak tree we planted the year Emily started kindergarten, the mailbox Thomas repainted every spring, even when the old paint still looked fine. Nothing had changed, and yet the moment I stepped inside the front door,
the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. I placed the pie on the kitchen counter and hung my coat on the same hook I had used for 30 years. The clock above the refrigerator read 9:23. That clock had been a wedding gift from Thomas's sister, and every evening he used to stand beneath it waiting for the 10 o'clock news to start. I could almost see him there if I closed my eyes long enough. Instead, I turned on the kitchen light and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Emily's words repeated themselves in my head with a strange, calm rhythm. Find a job or leave. It was such a practical sentence, almost polite in its structure, and yet it carried the weight of something much larger than money. For most of my life, I had worked in ways that never appeared on a paycheck. I raised Emily after Thomas's construction business kept him traveling across the state for weeks at a time. I kept the house running, paid the bills, drove to school meetings, and made sure there was always dinner on the table when he came home tired and covered in dust from job sites. When Emily was older, I took a part-time position at the public library for several years, mostly because I loved the quiet rows of books and the feeling of helping someone find exactly what they needed. But when Thomas's health began to decline 3 years ago, I left that job without hesitation. Caring for him during those final months felt more important than any schedule or paycheck. The doctors had explained everything carefully in the hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. His heart had simply grown too tired after decades of long days and heavy work. I stayed beside him through every appointment, every prescription refill, every slow walk through the backyard when he wanted fresh air. During those evenings, he often sat on the porch swing and told me not to worry about the future. He would squeeze my hand and say the house would always be my shelter. I remember those words clearly because Thomas was not a man who spoke dramatically. When he promised something, it usually meant he had already planned how to keep that promise. I poured myself a glass of water and walked into the living room, where his favorite chair still faced the television. The remote control rested on the armrest, exactly where he left it the morning he went to the hospital for the last time. I had never moved it. The quiet hum of the refrigerator traveled faintly from the kitchen, while the old furnace clicked on somewhere in the basement, pushing warm air through the vents as the outside temperature dropped into the low 50s. I sat down slowly on the sofa and looked around the room that held nearly half a century of my life. Photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace, Emily in a blue graduation missing one front tooth and laughing at something outside the frame. I studied that photograph for a long time, trying to remember the exact sound of her laughter. It was difficult to match that memory with the woman who had spoken across the dinner table only an hour earlier. The thought did not make me angry. It made me curious in a quiet way, the way a person feels when they realize a story they believed for years might not have been complete. Eventually, I stood up and turned off the living room lamp. The house settled into darkness, except for the pale blue glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. As I climbed the stairs toward my bedroom, one realization followed me step by step. Emily believed I had nowhere else to stand in this world. She believed I had become fragile the moment Thomas was gone. What she did not understand yet was that a long marriage teaches you many things, including how carefully some people prepare for the future without announcing it to anyone at the dinner table. I woke before sunrise the next morning, the way I had done for most of my adult life. Old habits stay with you, even when the reasons for them disappear. The house was still dark when I walked downstairs and turned on the small lamp above the kitchen sink. Outside the window, the sky over Columbus was a soft gray, the kind of quiet morning that usually meant a cool day ahead, probably somewhere around 60 degrees by afternoon. I filled the coffee maker with water and measured the same 2 scoops of ground coffee Thomas had always used. When the machine began to hum softly, the familiar smell slowly filled the kitchen, and for a moment the house felt almost normal again. I stood at the counter, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, listening to the quiet tick of the clock above the refrigerator. The words from the night before had not disappeared. They had simply settled somewhere deeper, like stones at the bottom of a lake. I poured a cup and carried it to the small table by the window, where Thomas and I used to sit every morning reading the newspaper. The newspaper was still delivered to the porch at 6:15 sharp, just as it had been for years, and I had picked it up on my way back inside. I opened it slowly, but I realized after a few minutes that I had not read a single headline. My thoughts kept circling back to Emily, not just to what she had said, but to how easily she had said it. There had been no anger in her voice, no hesitation, only certainty. That certainty told me something important. Emily believed she understood my situation completely. She believed she knew exactly how fragile my life had become after Thomas passed away. She believed I depended on her more than she depended on me. I set the newspaper aside and looked across the kitchen toward the hallway where the wooden cabinet stood against the wall. Thomas had built that cabinet himself nearly 20 years ago. Inside were old documents, photo albums, and the small metal lockbox where we kept important papers. I had not opened it since the week after the funeral because I had not felt ready to look at the past too closely. But that morning, something felt different. I carried my coffee across the room and opened the cabinet door. The lockbox was exactly where Thomas had always kept it, on the middle shelf. I lifted it carefully and placed it on the kitchen table. The metal felt cool under my hands as I turned the small key that hung on a chain inside the cabinet. The lid opened with a soft click. Inside were neatly organized folders, each labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting: insurance, property taxes, bank records. Thomas had always believed that paperwork should be simple and clear. I flipped slowly through the folders until I reached one labeled house deed. For a moment, I just stared at the words without opening it. I remembered the afternoon 3 years earlier when Thomas had asked me to drive with him to a small law office downtown. He had said it was just routine paperwork, something about making sure everything was in order. I had not thought much about it at the time because Thomas handled most of those details during our marriage. I trusted him completely, the same way he trusted me with everything inside our home. I opened the folder and unfolded the document inside. The official seal of Franklin County appeared at the top of the page. Beneath it were several lines of legal language that I read slowly and carefully. The meaning became clear within seconds. Thomas had transferred full ownership of the house into my name 3 years earlier. Not jointly, not temporarily, completely. I sat very still at the table as the realization settled over me. Emily had spoken the night before with the confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath her feet was solid. She had believed that the house, the place where I had lived most of my life, was something she could eventually control or perhaps even sell. I folded the document carefully and placed it back inside the folder. The coffee in my cup had gone cold by then, but I did not mind. For the first time since that dinner conversation, the quiet inside the house felt different. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space. Space to think clearly. Space to remember what Thomas had always understood about the future. I closed the lockbox and returned it to the cabinet, then walked back to the kitchen window, where the morning light had finally begun to brighten the street outside. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the block, and a delivery truck rolled slowly past the end of the cul-de-sac. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing exactly as it always had. Emily believed she had given me 2 choices. What she did not realize yet was that my life had never depended on the choices she imagined. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house more slowly than usual, noticing small details that had once blended quietly into the background of everyday life. The sunlight began to slide through the kitchen window around 7:30, stretching across the hardwood floor in long, pale rectangles that reminded me of mornings when Thomas used to sit at the table, drinking his coffee before heading out to work. I could still picture him clearly, the way he would fold the newspaper carefully and tap it against the table before standing up. Always the same routine, always the same calm sense that the day ahead could be handled one practical step at a time. Thomas believed in preparation more than anything else. He never trusted luck, and he never relied on assumptions. When he fixed something in the house, he checked every screw twice. When he signed a contract for a construction project, he read every page slowly before picking up a pen. That was simply the way he lived. I realized as I stood there watching the light move across the floor that he had approached our future with the same careful attention. 3 years earlier, when we drove to that quiet law office downtown, I remembered asking him why the paperwork mattered so much. He had smiled in that patient way of his and said that life could change faster than people expect, and that the best way to protect the people you love is to prepare for the day when you might not be standing beside them anymore. At the time, I had brushed off the comment because Thomas had always seemed strong to me, the kind of man who carried lumber across a job site without stopping to rest. But he had seen the changes in his health long before I allowed myself to admit they were real. I walked into the living room and paused beside the bookshelf where he kept a row of old photo albums. One of them was already slightly open, probably from the last time I had looked through it after the funeral. I lifted it carefully and sat down in his favorite chair. The first photograph inside showed our house when it was brand new, back when the front yard was still mostly dirt, and the oak tree was no taller than my shoulder. Emily was only 5 years old in that picture. She stood in the driveway holding a small red bicycle with training wheels, smiling as if the entire world belonged to her. I studied that photograph for a long time, wondering when the distance between that little girl and the woman at the dinner table had grown so wide. Families do not usually change all at once. The changes arrive quietly, year by year, hidden inside small decisions that seem harmless at the time. Emily moved out after college, then married Mark a few years later. They bought their own house across town and began building their lives the way young couples often do, focusing on careers and mortgages and long-term plans. Thomas and I stayed here, maintaining the house, trimming the oak tree every fall, watching the neighborhood grow older along with us. For many years, Emily still visited often. She called on Sundays. She brought groceries when Thomas started feeling tired more easily. But somewhere during the last decade, the rhythm shifted. Her visits became shorter. Conversations turned practical. She asked questions about property taxes, insurance policies, maintenance costs. At the time, I thought she was simply trying to help manage responsibilities as we aged. Looking back now, I realized she had been studying the structure of our lives in a different way. I closed the album gently and returned it to the shelf. The house remained quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower starting somewhere down the street. It was nearly 10 in the morning when I walked back into the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee. The document inside the lockbox had changed something important inside my mind. Not in a dramatic way. It was more like adjusting the focus of a lens. The situation Emily described at dinner was built on an assumption that no longer held any weight. She believed she understood the position I stood in after Thomas passed away. She believed that time and circumstance had slowly reduced my choices until I depended entirely on her approval. I stood by the window holding my coffee and watched a pair of squirrels run along the wooden fence in the backyard. The air outside looked crisp and clear, the kind of cool autumn morning when people start pulling sweaters from their closets. A thought crossed my mind then, simple and steady. Emily had spoken with certainty because she believed she held the advantage. But advantages in life often depend on information, and there were things she did not yet know. I did not call Emily that day, and she did not call me either. The silence between us stretched calmly across the afternoon, and I let it remain exactly that way. Sometimes the most powerful decision a person can make is simply to wait. Thomas used to say that patience reveals more truth than arguments ever do, and over the years I learned he was right about that. Instead of picking up the phone, I spent the day taking care of small things around the house. I watered the plants near the back window, folded a load of laundry, and walked out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway just before noon. The autumn air had warmed slightly, perhaps 63 degrees, and the oak tree in the yard dropped a few brown leaves that drifted slowly across the grass. Everything looked ordinary, which was comforting in a quiet way. After lunch, I returned to the kitchen table and opened the folder again, reading the property document one more time from beginning to end. The legal language was straightforward. The house belonged to me completely. No shared ownership, no conditions, no future transfer written into the agreement. Thomas had made sure of that. I remembered the look on his face that afternoon in the law office when the attorney slid the papers across the desk. He had not looked worried. He had looked calm, almost relieved. At the time, I thought he was simply organizing paperwork the way careful people do. Now I understood that he had been thinking further ahead than I realized. Later that afternoon, I decided to make a short drive into town. The office building where we signed those documents still stood near the courthouse downtown, a quiet brick structure with narrow windows and a small brass sign beside the door. I parked along the street and sat in the car for a moment, watching people walk along the sidewalk carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Life moved quickly in that part of the city, and no one noticed a 72-year-old woman sitting quietly behind a steering wheel. Eventually, I stepped out and walked inside. The reception desk was still in the same place, and behind it sat a young assistant who greeted me politely. When I explained that my husband Thomas Lawson had worked with their office several years earlier, she searched through the records and asked if I would like to speak with Mr. Harold Bennett, the attorney who handled many of those files. I recognized the name immediately. Thomas had mentioned him more than once over the years. Mr. Bennett appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, a tall man with silver hair and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades listening carefully to other people's problems. When he heard my name, his face softened with recognition. He shook my hand and offered his condolences for Thomas. We sat down in his office, and I explained that I simply wanted to confirm the details of the property transfer Thomas arranged before he passed away. Mr. Bennett opened a file drawer beside his desk and pulled out a folder that looked nearly identical to the one in my lockbox at home. He read through several pages quietly, then nodded once, as if everything was exactly as expected. He told me the paperwork had been completed 3 years earlier and recorded with the county without any complications. The house was legally mine in every sense of the word. No additional signatures were required, and no other person held any claim to it. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, the same tone a professional uses when confirming something simple and permanent. I thanked him and stood up to leave. As I walked back through the office hallway, I noticed a strange feeling settling inside me. Not anger and not satisfaction either. It was something steadier than both of those emotions. Outside the building, the afternoon sun had begun to slide lower toward the west, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I drove home slowly, thinking about the conversation at the dinner table 2 nights earlier. Emily had spoken as though my future depended on her decisions. She had spoken with the confidence of someone who believed the situation was already settled. But as the quiet streets of our neighborhood came back into view, I understood something clearly for the first time since Thomas passed away. The future she described was based on a misunderstanding, and sooner or later, misunderstandings have a way of revealing themselves. I returned home just before evening settled across the neighborhood, the sky turning a deeper shade of orange behind the rows of houses that lined our quiet street. The temperature had begun to drop again, probably somewhere near 55 degrees, and the air carried that crisp autumn smell that always reminded me of the years when Emily was young, and Thomas would rake the leaves into tall piles in the yard so she could jump into them laughing. I parked the car in the driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine off, looking at the front porch where the light had just switched on automatically as the sun dipped lower. The house looked exactly as it had the night before, and yet something inside me felt steadier now. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly up the front path, hearing the faint rustle of dry leaves beneath my shoes. Inside, the quiet greeted me again, but this time it did not feel heavy. It felt calm, almost patient. I set my keys on the small table by the door and moved through the kitchen, turning on the lamp above the stove. The house carried the same familiar scent of wood and coffee that had filled it for decades. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade from the backyard. My thoughts drifted back to the conversation with Mr. Bennett that afternoon. His words had been simple and clear. The house was legally mine. No shared ownership, no conditions. The kind of certainty that does not leave room for misunderstanding. I knew then that Emily's confidence at the dinner table had not come from facts, it had come from assumptions. Perhaps she believed that because Thomas had managed most of the financial details during our marriage, I would not understand them myself. Perhaps she believed that grief had made me confused or dependent. Or perhaps she simply believed that time had shifted the balance of authority in our family. I finished my water and placed the glass in the sink. The clock on the stove read 6:42 in the evening when the telephone rang. The sound echoed through the quiet kitchen in a way that made me pause for a second before answering. I picked up the receiver and heard Emily's voice on the other end of the line. Her tone was calm, almost casual, as if the conversation at dinner had been nothing more than a practical suggestion between adults. She asked how I was doing and whether I had thought about what we discussed.
I could picture her standing in her kitchen, probably leaning against the counter with the phone pressed to her ear, while Mark watched television in the next room. I answered her honestly. I told her that I had been thinking about many things lately. She said that was good, because it was important for me to be realistic about my situation. Her words were careful, but the message beneath them had not changed. She spoke about rising expenses, about how difficult it could be for someone my age to maintain a house alone. She said that finding some kind of work might help me stay active and responsible. I listened quietly while she explained these ideas, letting the silence stretch naturally between her sentences. Finally, she asked what I had decided to do. I looked around the kitchen while holding the phone, noticing the small details that had remained unchanged for so many years. The cabinet Thomas built with his own hands, the table where we shared thousands of meals, the window that faced the oak tree in the yard. All of it stood exactly where it had always stood. I told Emily that I appreciated her concern and that I understood she believed she was helping me face the future. My voice remained calm and steady as I spoke. I said that sometimes situations appear very different depending on what information people have. She hesitated slightly on the other end of the line, perhaps surprised by the tone of my answer. Before she could ask what I meant, I simply told her that we should talk again soon, preferably in person. Then I thanked her for calling and gently placed the receiver back onto the cradle. The kitchen returned to silence once more. Outside the window, the sky had turned dark blue, and the first porch lights along the street had begun to glow. I stood there for a moment thinking about how easily people can become certain of things they have never truly examined. Emily believed she understood the ground beneath my feet. She believed she had already measured the limits of my choices. But there are moments in life when the truth waits quietly in the background, patient and steady, until the right time arrives for it to be seen.
I woke the next morning with the quiet clarity that comes after a long night of thinking. The house was still dark when I walked downstairs, but the faint blue light of early dawn had already begun to slip through the curtains in the living room. The air felt cooler than the day before, probably somewhere around 49 degrees outside, and the furnace had turned on during the night, leaving a soft warmth in the hallway. I moved through the kitchen slowly, turning on the same small lamp above the sink and filling the coffee maker with water. The routine felt steady, almost comforting, and I realized that routine has a way of reminding you who you were long before anyone tried to redefine your place in the world. While the coffee brewed, I stepped onto the front porch to pick up the newspaper. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of a car passing at the far end of the cul-de-sac. The oak tree in the yard had dropped more leaves overnight, scattering them across the grass like small pieces of copper. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air before returning inside. When I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and the newspaper, I noticed something about my own thoughts that had changed. The worry I felt earlier in the week had disappeared. In its place was a quiet sense of patience, the kind that grows when you understand more about a situation than the other person involved. Emily believed that the conversation at the dinner table had already set the direction of my future. She believed she had given me a deadline, and that I would spend the following days searching for ways to satisfy it. But that was not what I had been doing. I had been remembering the way Thomas approached problems. He never rushed toward confrontation. Instead, he gathered the facts first, waited until every detail was clear, and then acted calmly when the moment was right. That morning, I finished my coffee and walked down the hallway to the cabinet again. The metal lockbox remained on the middle shelf where I had placed it the day before. I opened it and looked at the document one more time, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted the certainty to feel completely familiar in my hands. The official county seal, the recorded transfer date, the clean lines of legal language that confirmed the house belonged entirely to me. I closed the folder and placed it back inside the box. Then I returned the box to the cabinet and shut the door. The clock on the stove read 8:12 when the telephone rang again. This time I knew immediately who it would be. Emily's voice sounded slightly more direct than it had the night before. She asked whether I had made progress thinking about my situation. I told her I had been thinking very carefully. She said that was good because she and Mark had also been discussing practical options that could help everyone move forward. The way she said those words told me she had already reached her own conclusions. She mentioned that they had been looking at smaller apartments near the downtown area that might suit someone my age. She even said that a few places offered special rent rates for seniors who needed affordable housing. I listened quietly while she explained these ideas, letting the silence rest between us whenever she finished a sentence. Eventually, she asked if I would be ready to meet with her and Mark later that week to talk through the next steps. I told her that meeting in person sounded like a good idea. My voice stayed calm and even, and I could hear the faint pause on the other end of the line, as if she expected resistance that never came. We agreed to meet at my house on Saturday afternoon. After the call ended, I placed the receiver back on the cradle and looked around the kitchen again. The sunlight had begun to brighten the window above the sink, casting a warm glow across the wooden cabinets Thomas built years ago. Everything looked exactly as it always had. I walked to the window and watched a neighbor walking his dog along the sidewalk, the leash swinging gently in his hand. Life outside continued in its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet shift that had begun inside this house. Emily believed she was coming here on Saturday to finalize a plan for my future. What she did not yet understand was that the ground beneath that plan was not as solid as she imagined.
I spent the next 2 days moving through the house the way Thomas used to when he was preparing for something important, quietly and without rushing. The weather remained cool throughout the week, with afternoon temperatures hovering around 60 degrees, and the steady rhythm of autumn continued outside the windows. Leaves drifted down from the oak tree in the yard and gathered along the edge of the driveway, forming thin copper-colored lines that shifted whenever the wind passed through the neighborhood. Inside the house, everything remained calm and orderly. I cleaned the kitchen counters, watered the plants in the living room, and folded a few old blankets that had been sitting on the couch since the evening of the funeral. None of these tasks were urgent, but they gave me time to think clearly. I noticed that when people believe they hold control over a situation, they often become impatient for results. Emily called once more on Thursday afternoon, her voice careful but slightly more insistent than before. She asked if Saturday afternoon was still convenient for me. I told her that it was and that I would have coffee ready when she and Mark arrived. She sounded satisfied with that answer. After the call ended, I placed the receiver back on the cradle and looked around the kitchen. The afternoon sun was coming through the window above the sink, reflecting softly against the glass cabinet doors Thomas built years ago. I thought about how many conversations had taken place in this room over the decades. Birthdays, holidays, quiet breakfasts before long workdays. A house absorbs those memories slowly, layer by layer, until it becomes something more than a building. It becomes a record of the people who lived inside it. On Friday morning, I walked out to the backyard with a rake and gathered the leaves beneath the oak tree. The air smelled clean and cool, somewhere around 54 degrees, and the sky above the neighborhood was perfectly clear. While I worked, I remembered the many Saturdays Thomas spent doing exactly the same thing, slowly pulling the leaves into wide piles while Emily ran across the lawn as a child. For a moment, I could almost hear her laughter again, light and carefree, before the responsibilities of adulthood reshaped her priorities.
By the time Saturday arrived, the house looked exactly the way it always had. The living room was tidy, the kitchen table polished, and the coffee maker sat ready on the counter. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, I heard the sound of a car turning into the driveway. Through the front window, I saw Emily step out of the passenger side while Mark parked the car. I invited them into the kitchen and poured 3 cups of coffee. The same quiet kitchen where Thomas and I had spent thousands of ordinary mornings now held a different kind of conversation waiting to happen. Emily sat at the table and placed her hands together in front of her, her expression focused and confident. She began explaining that she and Mark had spent the past few days researching options that could make things easier for everyone involved. She spoke about small apartments near downtown, about affordable housing programs for seniors, and about how selling a larger house could free up money for the future. Mark occasionally added a practical comment about maintenance costs and property taxes. I listened carefully to every word without interrupting. When Emily finished speaking, she looked at me with the calm expectation of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. For a moment, I simply held my coffee cup and watched the steam rise slowly into the air. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the refrigerator. Then I placed the cup down on the table and walked to the cabinet in the hallway. I opened the door, took out the metal lockbox, and carried it back to the kitchen. Emily's expression shifted slightly as she watched me unlock the lid. I removed the folder and placed the document gently on the table between us. Neither of them spoke while I slid the paper across the polished wood surface. Sometimes the most powerful explanation is the one that does not require many words at all. I watched the silence settle over the kitchen as Emily and Mark looked down at the document on the table. The afternoon light from the window rested across the paper, illuminating the county seal and the clean lines of text that Thomas had signed 3 years earlier. Neither of them spoke at first. Mark leaned forward slightly, reading more carefully, while Emily's eyes moved slowly across the page, as if she expected the words to rearrange themselves into something else. The ticking of the clock above the refrigerator sounded louder than usual in the quiet room. I did not interrupt them. Some realizations need space to arrive on their own. After a long moment, Emily lifted her head and looked at me with an expression that was no longer confident. It was not anger exactly. It was the look of someone realizing that the ground beneath their assumptions had shifted. She asked when this had happened. Her voice sounded careful now, almost uncertain. I told her that Thomas arranged the transfer 3 years earlier. He believed it was important to make sure I would always have a secure place to live, no matter what happened in the future. Mark glanced at the document again, then leaned back in his chair. The practical certainty he carried when they arrived had disappeared quietly. Emily's hands rested on the table beside the paper, and for the first time since the conversation began, she did not seem to have a prepared explanation waiting. The kitchen remained calm and familiar around us. The cabinets Thomas built stood exactly where they always had, and the coffee cups sat untouched on the table, their warmth slowly fading into the cool air of the room. I folded my hands together and spoke gently, the same way Thomas used to explain things when Emily was young and upset about something that did not go her way. I told her that I understood she believed she was helping me think about the future. I said that it is natural for people to worry about their parents as time moves forward, but I also told her that decisions about my life would be made by me, not by assumptions about what I could or could not handle.
Emily looked down at the document once more. The certainty that filled her voice earlier in the week had been replaced by something quieter. She said she did not know Thomas had arranged this. I nodded slowly, because that part was true. Thomas had never been a man who explained every detail of his plans. He simply made sure that people he loved were protected. Outside the kitchen window, a breeze moved through the branches of the oak tree, sending a few more leaves drifting across the yard. The afternoon sun had begun to soften toward evening, casting long shadows across the grass. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Emily finally asked why I had not mentioned any of this earlier. I considered the question carefully before answering. I told her that sometimes people reveal what they truly believe when they think no one is watching too closely. The conversation at the dinner table earlier that week had shown me something important. It showed me how easily respect can disappear when someone assumes another person has lost their independence. I stood up from the table and carried the document back to the lockbox. The metal lid closed with a quiet click as I returned it to the cabinet in the hallway. When I walked back into the kitchen, Emily and Mark were both standing now, unsure of what to say next. I told them they were always welcome to visit, just as they had been for years, but the house would remain exactly where it was and exactly as Thomas intended. Emily nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling across her expression. When they stepped outside a few minutes later, the sky had turned a deeper shade of orange above the rooftops. I watched through the window as they walked down the driveway and climbed into their car. The engine started, and the vehicle rolled slowly back toward the end of the cul-de-sac. When the street became quiet again, I returned to the kitchen and poured the last of the coffee into my cup. The house felt peaceful in a way it had not felt since the evening Thomas left for the hospital months earlier. Sometimes the strongest answer in life is not raised in anger or argument. Sometimes it is simply the quiet truth placed carefully on a table, waiting for others to see it for themselves.